Hi, everybody. My name is Eric Green. I am the owner of Master Tech Environmental. I'm an indoor air quality expert. I am a mold inspector assessor and a mold remediator based in New Jersey. Today, we're going to talk about the origins of residential mold, or how a lot of my clients put it, where did mold come from all of a sudden? It was never an issue when I was growing up. My parents didn't have mold. Now, all of a sudden, you're telling me I've got dangerous mold in my house? Something doesn't quite add up. Well, it does. We're going to learn a little bit about it today. We're going to talk about the origins of residential mold, specifically in the US. This applies to a lot of our construction and history, how we got to where we are today. But let's start off with some basics. What are some of the basics? Well, first, the history. People say mold has just shown up all of a sudden, but the reality is we've known about mold for a long time. In fact, it's in the Bible. Book of Leviticus, chapter 14, which deals with disease and leprosy and skin disease and mold. So in there, it talks about how a priest may inspect a home and what to look for to identify mold and what should be done to clean it and discard mold affected items. Very simplistic, but very similar to what we do today as professional mold inspectors and remediators. So way back in the Bible, it was known and it was recognized as a danger. All right, let's jump ahead a bit. How about the Salem witch hysteria? Well, many historians believe that an ergot infestation, and ergot is a mold that affects rye seeds, and they made a lot of rye bread in Massachusetts at that time. But they're saying that this ergot infestation caused strange activities to break out among some of the women who were working with and eating the bread in the 1690s. And eventually that led to the Salem witch hunts. Now, toxicologists know that ergot poisoning can lead to convulsions and spasms and hallucinations, crawling sensations on the skin. If you believe that a witch has hexed you or cursed you or put a bad spell on you, well, it would probably look something like hallucinations and crawling skin and convulsions and spasms. So that seems like a really good cause for what brought the Salem witch trials around, which was a mold disease. Finally, I'll talk to you guys briefly about the curse of King Tut's tomb in Egypt, right? So that became famous after about 10 or so of the explorers and scientists who opened the tomb originally, they died under mysterious circumstances. And many theorize that there was an exposure, when the tomb was open, there was an exposure to these guys and gals to aspergillus mold and aflatoxins associated with it. And that could have been the culprit in at least some of these deaths. All right. So we've known about mold. We've been concerned about mold. We know about its health effects. That's a little bit of the history. Let's talk about the science of it. All right. So here is a microscope picture of mold, right? Specifically, this is penicillium. And to the left, where you can see all these squiggly lines, these are stems and roots. We call them mycelia. And on the right, all of these dots and circles are spores. And that's how a mold actually reproduces. These spores are very light. They can get carried on air. When they land on a surface that has the requisite conditions for growth, it will start a new colony. And these spores are a lot of what creates people's allergies. We're allergic to those, right? So when we talk about mold, we need to know that it's getting into the right conditions. If it lands on a surface that's not great for growth, it'll just sit there dormant, not going to hurt anybody unless you happen to breathe it in and you're allergic. But what are those conditions? What conditions does mold need in order to grow? It's not about sunlight. It's not about hot and cold. It's about water and food. If it has those two things, it will grow. Maybe a little bit more slowly, maybe a little bit more quickly, but it needs those two. So water can be liquid water, right? It could be something that's wet or a puddle. It could be humidity. It could be water vapor. Is enough moisture for some molds to grow? And what is food? Well, the food is anything that's cellulotic. All right, what's cellulotic? Wood, cardboard, dust, dead plants, paper, anything that used to be a living, growing organism with cells and now is no longer alive, so it's not as resistant. And now you've got the perfect food for mold. And if we get that food wet, it is a mold smorgasbord. They love it. and they're going to get to eating. So that's what we're creating in our homes now. We've been building our homes for the past 80 years that have a lot of water and have a lot of food. But let's talk about that. How did we get there? Well, how did we used to build houses, right? We built them out of stone and masonry and those kind of natural materials. You wanted something that would last, you'd build it out of fieldstone or brick or block. And that's great, a lot of advantages, but it's labor intensive, slow, expensive, and not very flexible. So what do we do now? We build our homes out of dimensional lumber, wood, 2x4s, plywood. Why? It's cheaper, it's strong, it's flexible, and you can build it a lot quicker. And that's why most of the homes in the United States are built this way. Now, what about the insides of our homes? What about inside our spaces, right? Well, we did plaster and lath for a while, right? Lath is the lathing strips, right? These strips of wood here that you can see in the upper left-hand corner. The plaster is pushed into it from the other side. That's the finished side, and it spills through. And these little keyways here hold the plaster up against the wood. What's great about plaster is it's a beautiful finished, okay, interior, and it's also a fire break. It will stop or reduce the spread of fires. Because if you remember, and you probably don't, in the 17, 18, early 1900s, we had fires just leveling whole communities because everything was just built out of wood and people would die. So we went to plaster. But plaster is expensive and slow. So that's why we moved to what we do and use today, which is drywall. Now, drywall was invented in 1916, but we didn't use it until much later because it was seen as poor man's plaster, right? Nobody wanted to be seen as a poor guy. But as the needs changed, and they soon did, all right, we got to a point where we replaced our plaster and stone, which are non-cellulotic materials, with wood and drywall, which is cellulotic. If we get it wet consistently, it's going to become mold food. All right, so here we are today. We've got all of that. What or who, what's responsible for the things? What's the chain of events that led to these changes and the moisture that's going to come to light in just a minute? Well, let's start off with three things that you guys are probably aware of: the Great Depression, World War II, and the American Legion. Well, what do these three things have to do with mold? Well, I will tell you. Good question. Let's look at this first column, right? Between 1900 and 1939, that's 40 years. We built about 12 million homes in the United States. Seems like a lot, but it's not, because 20 years later, the following 20 years, we built 15 in half the time. And another 20 years, we built over 20, and then almost 25 in the following 20 after that. So what's going on here? Why was it so slow? Why did it speed up? Well, leading into the Depression, okay, we were building homes the old-fashioned way, nice and slow, stone and maybe some plaster. But the Depression slowed everything down. We were already behind on construction with all of these homes in foreclosure. People couldn't afford to buy new homes. There was no money to pay for upgrades or even, God forbid, something new. So we were way behind. And just as we started to get out from under that a little bit, we enter World War II. Now, once we go into World War II, what happens? Most of the workers are going into the armed services. The United States is restricting non-essential building. They want all the resources and the labor that's left working on the war effort. So we just got out of a big slump, and then we enter our own next 5 years of we're not building anything else. So it really exacerbated the situation, okay? The war is over. 1945 VJ Day, we had 12 million enlisted in the military. And in the course of 3 months, that went from 12 million to 3 million. And those 9 million were coming home. And everybody who had been working and living in shared apartments and tents in the United States are like, great, the war's over. We need a place to live. All right. So what happened there was you had all of these veterans coming home. The American Legion looked around and said, we remember World War I, and those veterans got screwed. We want to make sure that these guys don't. So they put an enormous pressure campaign on Congress, and they passed what became known as the GI Bill. So really, most of our GIs coming home, they needed a future, they needed a place to live. So what ended up happening was the VA backed nearly 24 million home loans for World War II veterans. All right, and that boosted home ownership from like 44% in 1940 to 62% in 1960. That's probably where the American dream came from. I don't know. I didn't research that. Just putting it out there. So that led to a need to build new homes because you had all of this money coming through the GI Bill. If you were a politician that wanted to get elected in the late 40s, early 50s, and you weren't talking about the housing crisis, you were not getting elected. So that's what led to the building of all of these homes. And if we wanted to build them fast and efficiently, it was stick construction and it was drywall. All right. So that was half of it. Now we know plaster and lath too slow, drywall much faster. And what happens if we've got drywall and it gets wet? Boom, we get mold. But how do we get the wet? How do we get the moisture? Well, because we started building these houses in 45. And if you're sitting there saying, well, my parents didn't have this issue, you're talking about the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. Why is there mold now? All right, another player has entered the room. Let's talk about the 1973 Yom Kippur War between Israel and the Arab states. And I know today it's 2023. We're still talking about the Middle East. It was an issue then. It's going to continue to be an issue for a while. But let's just talk about how it's affected mold. So the Yom Kippur War is going on. The U.S. wants to back Israel. All right. And we backed Israel big. Now, remember, this is 1973. We sent them over $2 billion worth of weapons. Henry Kissinger was looking at Israel and they realized Israel might lose, but Israel had nuclear weapons. So he didn't want Israel. And whatever you think about Henry Kissinger, people think he's a hero or a villain. I don't know. But in this case, he wanted to avoid a nuclear war. So he orchestrated with the administration sending over $2 billion worth of weapons and defense systems to Israel. And it probably kept Israel from throwing some nukes. But who did that piss off? Pissed off King Faisal and the Arab states. The Arab states were like, hey, you guys are playing favorites, so we're going to hit you where it hurts. They put together a global embargo, not a global, but an embargo on oil exports to the U.S. and countries who were supporting Israel. That led to the first 1973 gas crisis. And that's what most people remember, is that gas lines at gas stations, gas prices went through the roof. Well, guess what else went through the roof? The cost of energy to heat and cool our homes. Home heating oil, natural gas, propane, all of this stuff is now tied, and all of those prices went up. Costs went up 300% in 6 months. So this was a catastrophe, and we needed to respond, and we needed to change things in the US so we weren't so dependent on this foreign oil. So we had marketing campaigns. Don't be fuelish. Wasn't that cute? Save energy, do carpools, keep your speed down. That's when the national speed limit of 55 was introduced. That's gone. That's gone now, but that's when that started, was to save gas. The Department of Energy was created. The National Strategic Petroleum Reserve was created. NASCAR reduced all of their race distances by 10% to be more eco-friendly. This was back in the 70s, right? And one thing that happened that is critical to what we're talking about here, in 1976, Congress authorized the Weatherization Assistance Program because we recognized that so much fuel was being wasted heating and cooling homes that were not well insulated and not well sealed. So buildings, old and new, were being insulated, sealed, and all potential gaps where warm air could escape and cold air could get in and vice versa, those were being filled. They were being filled. So all in the name of reducing costs and expenses and fuel consumption. But what did we do is we made all of our previous homes and all of our new homes much less breathable. And you're not just talking about temperature that goes out of those cracks, you're also talking about humidity and moisture. And as soon as we sealed up these homes made of wood and drywall paper, we created perfect environments across the nation for mold growth. Water plus food equals mold. And that's why we've got way more mold now than we did before those two things happened. Remember, World War II, the Great Depression, the American Legion, the Yom Kippur War, $2.2 billion worth of support to Israel, and an oil embargo that made our oil costs go through the roof. So good intentions often lead to unintended consequences. And that's why there's so much mold in residential structures here in the United States. Guys, I hope that was interesting and informative. I know it went a little bit long, but I'm super passionate about this. So that's why I talk a lot about it. Happy mold hunting. I hope there's no mold in your house, but I hope you have a better understanding now of what creates the environments that create mold. I'm Eric Green, Master Tech Environmental. Thank you guys so much.